Good afternoon, good morning, um, good evening to some of our guests today. Welcome to our Windward webinar today on disruption to regulation and AI-driven strategies, I think, in helping compliance. Um, I think we're going to give the audience a few more minutes just to join. We have a lot of people that are very keen to join us today. So we'll give them a couple of minutes before we start. I think we're almost there. Oh, we're going to wait 2 more minutes. So I think we're nearly ready to go. Um, let's go. Okay. I have the all clear, so we can commence. Hi everybody, and a big welcome to the our Windward webinar today on disruption and regulation and how AI-driven strategies can help in terms of compliance. I'm Simon Ring. I'm going to be the moderator of today's awesome panel. I'm a director of the trading and shipping divisions at Windward, based in London. And I guess I've been involved in these areas, maritime, trade, and supply chain compliance for probably over a decade, similar to every one of our panelists today. Um, Today, we're going to be talking about not just the current regulatory landscape, but also the geopolitical landscape as well. And I think it's quite timely that we're talking about this just a few days after the second anniversary of the Russia-Ukraine conflicts. And all of these things have a massive cause and effect, as we all know, on trade and global supply chains. But I'm going to start by introducing genuinely people I've known for a while, but a great panel to discuss this with today. We're really delighted that you could all spare the time and find the time. I know you're all very busy people um, in current climate, but all find the time to join us today. Firstly, Eva Monard, welcome, Eva. Our friends at Steptoe Legal. Eva's a partner. She's based in Brussels. She practices on EU international trade controls. She works with companies, governments, the EU Commission, and she's going to help us. It's a big ask, Eva, to unpack some of the more recent regulations. There's a lot of them, right? So, welcome, Eva. Secondly, Lina Oswald, welcome, Lina, to the panel discussion today. I think your background as well is legal from years previous, but Lina's worked for some of the biggest financial institutions and is currently the global head at Glencore of Sanctions, KYC, and AML. Just a small job. Lina, I'm delighted you could find the time to join us today. And lastly, but by no means least, Mr. Barron, sir, how are you?
Hi, Simon. Hi, everyone.
I'm not going to put a number, but a lifetime's worth of experience, I think, in these areas, right? Richard, I think, started work at RWE many moons ago, but has worked at COFCO and is now all things sanctions and compliance as the global head for Socar. So a big welcome to all of you to today's panel. I wanted to start by just fundamentally looking back a little bit at how we got to where we are today. And I think everybody here on the panel, when we met, it's difficult to set an agenda for a panel to discuss sanctions because they change so quickly. And obviously last week was paramount to that. But In my experience, anyway, you can go back to about 2015 when we saw the first iteration from the UN about advisories in maritime sanctions and process. And I think in those days, as all of our panelists, I'm sure many of our listeners today will recognize, that was really about nuclear proliferation. It was about stopping actors and players getting certain elements of processes and circumventing all of that program around areas like Iran and North Korea. And then following that, lots of advisories. But I think the real benchmark in terms of our conversations today came in 2020, in April, I think, of 2020, when we saw the Tri-Seal, not the Quint, but the Tri-Seal advisory coming out of the US regulators. There was a lot of work that went into that prior to that, and I'm sure many of our panelists were part of State Department's program of work prior to that in terms of engaging industry bodies and so on in terms of the scope and focus of that. But I think in many ways that 2020 advisory set a benchmark. And it didn't just widen the numbers of actors and players that were engaged or being focused on by regulations in these areas. But I think also it, for the first time, started to look at illicit activity, sanction circumvention, and set a whole new kind of level of process that obviously people are expected to adhere to in current climate. I mean, leading on from that, as we said, difficult to set an agenda for a meeting like today. But in the last few months, on Friday alone, I think we saw 600 entities designated or listed from 11 different countries, all added to the enforcement actions list. I guess that shouldn't be a surprise, the second anniversary, the current geopolitical climate that we see there. But I think in the run-up to Christmas and the last 2 or 3 months, EU sanctions package 11, 12, 13, we've seen the Quint Seal guidance, 5, not 3 bodies behind that one. The last time I had a bit of a count up, somebody might get me wrong here, but around a dozen of all enforcement actions that we've seen. But outside of that, I think what's really important is obviously the geopolitical climate as well, and the ongoing conflicts that we're seeing now in not just in Russia, in Ukraine, the Red Sea crisis. We're seeing political instabilities in Venezuela. I mean, even levels of water in the Panama Canal all have a cause and effect and disrupt global supply chains and global trade. So I think those are all part of what we're going to be talking about on our panel today. At Windward, we've been working pretty hard, I think, in terms of putting out support, data insights, weekly marketing updates for people. So even our CEO, Amy, is regularly now on CNN and the BBC talking about these things. So a lot of that is there. And if anybody after today's webinar is interested in some of that information and data, please reach out to us and we can obviously share that with you. I mentioned Eva at the start of this. We were going to ask you to try and unpack some of this, and there's a lot. The regulators seem very focused now, going from 2020 to all the updates and regulatory programs we've seen on more than list-based screening. They're looking at illicit activity, deceptive practices, sanction circumvention. So maybe you could break down for us a little bit some of those regulations, the cause and effect they have on companies in the maritime and trade and supply chains, and also how these are having a cause and effect on compliance, and maybe the reasons you think that we're now seeing the regulators kind of double down on Russia. Not to ask, Eva, in 10 minutes. I know you could speak for 2 days on this, but
I probably could, yes, but thank you very much, Simon, and hello, everyone. Thanks to Simon and his colleagues for inviting me to be on this panel. As Simon mentioned at the beginning, so I am based in Brussels. I'm an EU lawyer, so I'm advising clients on a daily basis on EU sanctions issues. Now, in doing that, we often of course, advise together with our US colleagues. So I have a general understanding of what is going on in the US sanctions, regularly touch base, of course, with my US colleagues and from other jurisdictions to understand what's going on in the different jurisdictions. So, but I am an EU lawyer, so I will be focusing on the EU sanctions, but I will also just share some brief comments on some key developments in the area of US sanctions. So I think Simon really hit the nail when he was saying that the focus on these sanctions developments and in the EU speaking about specifically the 11th, 12th sanctions package, for instance, it's really on combating these illicit activities, circumvention. And so the EU sanctions in general, I mean, they're unprecedented. The EU sanctions against Russia had never been done before by the EU, and more generally, it had never been done before, I think, worldwide, that a jurisdiction imposed such significant trade restrictions on such an important trading partner, because Russia was the 5th largest trading partner of the EU before all of this. Now, when it comes to the maritime industry, also there it is absolutely unprecedented, but there how the maritime industry really came into focus was mainly indeed in the framework of all of these circumvention activities, basically focusing on the maritime industry as a tool to try to tackle certain developments that occurred further to the adoption of other restrictions. For instance, there is the oil price cap, which is, of course, directly relevant for the maritime industry. But then what happened is that given all of the activities that were aimed or at the very least resulted in circumvention of the applicable restrictions, that the EU and other jurisdictions have been looking into ways to try to tackle that by imposing additional restrictions, including a lot of significant restrictions on the maritime industry. Now, maybe walking through the different packages that have been adopted by the EU, the latest packages. So in the 11th sanctions package, I think one very relevant element for the maritime industry, for vessels, for logistics more generally, was the significant expansion of the prohibition on transit through Russia. Now, so in the EU sanctions on Russia, there's a lot of products that cannot be supplied to Russia. You cannot supply a wide range of products, items, technology to Russia. Now, what the EU saw is that a lot of products that were not destined in principle for Russia, but were destined for other countries, oftentimes neighboring countries, for instance, that actually never arrived in those countries because they passed through just purely transport-wise. That was the idea, through Russia, but then eventually these goods never ended up where they were supposed to end up. So that is why the EU came up with this transit ban already before the 11th sanctions package with respect to firearms and dual use items. But so in the 11th sanctions package, the EU really took that ban and brought it to the next level by including aviation jet fuel, but mainly the so-called Annex 7 goods, which is a very broad list of goods that now cannot transit through Russia. They cannot be transported in any way through Russia. In the 12th sanctions package, by the way, this transit prohibition was further broadened by including the so-called battlefield goods. So this is a list that battlefield sounds like goods used really to engage in war activities, but these are actually goods that were commonly found on the battlefield in Ukraine, and they include microelectronics, navigation equipment, cameras, certain manufacturing equipment, so a very wide range of goods again, as a result of which there's now actually a lot of products that cannot be passing through Russia at all. Now, of course, a vessel is typically loaded with so many different containers, so many different kind of goods. So ensuring that these items do not transfer somehow via Russia is something that and that was something that we've seen, that we're still seeing, is creating a real headache for exporters of those products, and even more for then the operators of vessels, maritime industry players, that need to ensure that the exporters basically are not violating their obligations by then having these goods pass through Russia. So that was a very important one, I think. Then another one is that the EU has been basically limiting the access to EU ports and locks for certain vessels that engage in what is considered to be suspicious behavior. So again, this goes here now to circumvention of the price cap when it comes to oil transfers, mainly. So basically what the EU said is, okay, look, whenever a vessel turns off their transponder, or a vessel that is engaged in ship-to-ship transfers that are in violation of the restrictions on Russian oil, in that case, basically, that vessel cannot get access to EU ports and locks. So what is the EU trying to do? It's trying to basically use other elements like the access to its own ports, the access to its own locks, to avoid or make it much more difficult for vessels to engage in certain circumventing activities. So that was also the 11th sanctions package. Then in the 12th sanctions package, there were, again, more enforcement measures, more due diligence requirements with relation to the price oil cap. There is, as I'm sure you're all very well aware, distinction between tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 actors. And basically with the 12th sanctions package, there's now additional attestation information requirements in relation to getting access to the actual price information. In the 13th sanctions package, also the EU took a specific issue with the fact that Russia developed some sort of a shadow fleet, and they wanted to also make it much more difficult for Russian operators to get access to vessels, basically, so to tankers. So there is a prohibition to sell tankers to any Russian company or anyone for use in Russia. Now, what the EU also did is it created a notification requirement for any kind of sale or transfer of ownership of a tanker to anyone, even not Russians, anyone who is not EU. Basically, if someone wants to sell a tanker to someone outside the EU, there is a notification requirement. Why is that there? It's, of course, again, the idea is that EU member states can do that, to use that to check whether indeed this is not a sale that eventually would bring this tanker in the hands of a Russian company, or that this tanker would be used in Russia. So again, the whole idea being to tackle this kind of circumvention measures. But of course, also all of this creates a myriad of restrictions of different aspects that a lot of operators will need to keep in mind, and that make the due diligence very, very, very burdensome. That, I mean, you want to understand the vessels with whom you're dealing, what kind of activities they have been engaging with, for two reasons. One, because sometimes by engaging with certain vessels that are involved in certain activities, you yourself could be in violation of EU sanctions, or separately, even if you would not be violating EU or other sanctions, it is possible that by relying on vessels that are actually engaged in other kind of activities that are not allowed, your whole supply chain is put at risk. Because you want to be sure that your goods, for instance, that all transport is taking place timely, in the right way, that you don't all of a sudden engage a full stop of products that are key to your or your customers' supply chain. Mm-hmm. And that actually brings us to development. I think it was also, Simon, you mentioned it also, the Quinn Seal note of the US. It's a compliance note, which is it's very interesting. It basically provides for a number of practices that are considered to be very at high risk of actually being sanctions evasions, and then also says, okay, in order to address this, operators need to keep in mind the following due diligence recommendations. Now, I think this note is very important because it lays down all of this in writing very clearly. But actually, most of the elements there that are in there were not shocking to us, and I think to most of the people here, in the sense that many of these items were things that we were already advising clients on, where we were already saying, okay, these are things that you should be taking into account. These are things that Windward was, for instance, focusing already for a long time. But it is interesting to see how this is now all laid down in this note, and it, of course, elevates the importance of looking into these things and of carrying out the relevant due diligence. Now, some of the practices that this Quint note refers to, for instance, or ship-to-ship transfers, or registration changes, so-called flag hopping, if the ownership or management is very complex. These are all kind of, let's say, red flags that are highlighted in this note as being suggestive of sanctions evasion, sanctions circumvention. Looking then at the diligence measure, the risk-based due diligence approach that is put forward here, there is, of course, the compliance programs, nothing specific new, but that, of course, they are, whenever we speak about due diligence, they are a crucial element. The note also refers to the need to monitor location, to have contractual requirements, to screen basically what vessels have been doing in the past, whether they have been involved in manipulation or the disabling of their location information, etc. Know your customer, of course, due diligence on all counterparties. So, I mean, obviously, these are a lot of these elements are things that will sound very familiar to many people on this webinar today, but that, of course, are very relevant to see put in writing specifically with respect to the maritime industry. And I think with that, I'm not going to say that I have unpacked all of the relevant latest developments, but I have touched upon some of the
we could be here for weeks.
Developments.
Yeah,
yes,
absolutely. No, that's great. I mean, interestingly to me as well, I never thought I'd see the day that you saw regulatory advisories talking about things like satellite imagery, you know, in terms of enhanced due diligence and process. But it's quite amazing to look at all of those things. Eva, thank you so much. That's a really good breakdown of the kind of processes and the regulations we're seeing. Thank you so much. Actually, one last question, Eva, whilst we're on this, which may be sensible to speak about now. One of the designations we saw on last week from the US was SOFCOMFLOT. To most of the audience here today, that's a no-go, right? Since 2022. But it seems that the previous designations were vessel-specific. We've seen another 14 vessels designated, I think, in this package. But for people that are a bit confused, could you explain? I mean, we've now got STF as a listed entity in its entirety. What does that actually mean? I mean, to companies in terms of whether you are or aren't within oil cap, attestation requirements or not? Does that mean we can or can't deal with, or people can or can't deal with STF?
Thanks, Simon. And that is, I think, a very good question that illustrates the complexities associated with all of this. Because as a starting point, in principle, a designation, whether that is a US designation or an EU designation, will, in general terms, boil down to the same thing. You are not supposed to engage in any business with these entities. So that is indeed the starting point now. However, both in the EU and in the US, the situation with respect to SOFCOMFLOT specifically is much more complex. In the US also, there is the General License 93, which does authorize under certain conditions transactions that involve vessels that are owned directly or indirectly by SOFCOMFLOT. If it's not these vessels, these 14 vessels indeed that you mentioned that have been independently listed. So there are still indeed possibilities to engage with vessels of SOFCOMFLOT from a US perspective. Also from the EU, actually, here, SOFCOMFLOT Sovcomflot itself is not listed, designated, not subject to an asset freeze in the EU. However, and that's, I think, an important one to flag, one of the Sovcomflot subsidiaries, Sunship Management, which operates, I think, a relevant fleet, that one has been designated, and they're basically, so vessels that are owned or controlled by Sunship Management, that's an absolute no-go. Now, at the same time, Sovcomflot in the EU itself, Sovcomflot itself, is subject to the so-called transaction ban, which it's Article 5A, basically, which says you cannot engage in any transaction with a number of entities, including Sovcomflot. However, there is immediately an exception that is provided for those transactions that are strictly necessary for the purchase or transport of oil from or to Russia, if this is done in line with the other restrictions like the price cap. So basically, also from an EU perspective, if you are not dealing with Sunship Management, with respect to Sovcomflot, you can, as a rule, not engage in any transactions. However, if it is strictly necessary, which is, again, I mean, rather very high standard, so requires quite some analysis at times, but if it is strictly necessary for the purchase, transport of oil, in that case, there is an exception that applies. And basically, in that case, you are still allowed, also from the EU perspective, to deal with vessels of Sovcomflot. So, I mean, clearly, it shows really well, very well, the complexity of the setup created by these sanctions.
Eva, thank you. Turning to Lina, Richard. Obviously, I know that both of you on a day-to-day basis super busy, and again, thank you for finding the time to speak with us today. It's a huge challenge operating in these environments and climates, and obviously the disruptions, the geopolitics, as well as the actual regulatory programs and complexity of that, all make it very difficult. I mean, Lina, maybe I can ask you first. What are the key challenges that you face? I mean, you run a global operation for a huge company and a huge team. I mean, how do you face these day by day? What are the major challenges?
So I would say the most challenging thing is the Russia sanctions. So although our company has a general position to not enter into new trade contracts involving Russian or origin goods due to the heightened sanctions risk, but also because of the reputational risk, we do have some legacy business where we have contracts that are not subject, or let's say not yet subject to any sanctions, and do not involve any goods that have restrictions. So such contracts we continue to honor until such time that they expire. However, when you do business with Russia, so for example, if you want to use a vessel, in the beginning with let's say, I call it the latest round of Russia sanctions, because there has been waves throughout the last years, but throughout the latest rounds of Russia sanctions, in the beginning, there were many major shipping lines that did not want to enter into any Russian port. So you had to find smaller operators that would do that. We as a company, I'm not going to say we only use major shipping lines, but we have been using, or we are using, mostly major shipping lines. So that was a struggle in the beginning. Obviously, the Russia sanctions are very complex, and as we have already said today, they are often changing, and we see it latest on Friday, many new sanctions. So it requires that you have a strong compliance team with sanctions experts. I do think that, for example, I have seen from competitors, I have seen from, in my previous role, also from customers that have had compliance departments, but not necessarily a sanctions expert. And I think in today's environment, if you do operate in jurisdictions that have higher risk than, for example, Europe, then it is a must that you have a sanctions expert working for your company. But I can give you one example of an issue or a tricky situation that we were having quite recently. So for one of our legacy contracts that involves the area around Ukraine and Russia. So we were going to go to Odessa and pick up material, and the vessel that we were using got hit by a missile on the way there. So we then investigated what happened, and there was some casualties on the vessel, but our material was not yet on the vessel. So the vessel ended up getting repaired, and our material could still be picked up in Odessa. And our commodity department also requested later on an approval for the same kind of setup shortly after that incident. And at that time, everything went smoothly. So you never know what's going to happen if you are operating in that area, for example. From a purely compliance point of view, we obviously check and make background checks in vessel screening tools. So from a pure sanctions point of view, everything was fine with the vessel. But when you are operating in that area, you also have other risks, like war risk, right? And that's a risk that is in our company mostly covered by the business and the legal department, and not necessarily compliance, but we are in close collaboration. And also there is a huge disruption with the Houthi attacks that are driving up the prices, causing delivery delays in the commodities that we trade. And we see that due to those market conditions, traders are rather switching to supply from LME storage, which is economically less preferred in the commodity trading world. It's more expensive. So you have two options, right? Either you go into the risk area, or you have to go around the African continent, which takes longer, obviously, and causes higher costs and delays.
Yeah, Lina, thank you for that. I mean, Richard, we've talked about this previously as well. I mean, same question, I guess. Share some of your experience with us, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, Simon, it's the sort of the constantly evolving landscape, and I think one of the things people should be very mindful of is sort of trying to be cute and trying to sort of arbitrage sanctions, and I think that's not a good idea. I think in most trading houses you have a lot of nationalities, you have a lot of trading desks, a lot of exposure in various ways. So I don't think you can say, well, I'm in Geneva, so I don't care about UK sanctions. For example, I'm a UK person, so we have a very much across the board approach. And also, of course, whatever might be legal or might not, you have to convince your banks and your finance partners of that. So there's a fairly high chance, I suspect, that certain companies we might have mentioned already, any payments going through the financial system would be subject to a great deal of scrutiny, and the bank may well turn around and say, well, get something from OFAC that proves you can do this. So it's not just the sanctions, it's I suppose the reputational considerations around that, and also it's the machinery around it as well, in terms of your insurance, your banking, that also has to be lined up. And then the wider question, just to touch on it, we probably have people sort of attending this webinar thinking, well, it's an interesting topic, but we don't trade Russian oil, we don't trade anywhere near Venezuela. Why? How does this interest me? And I think the point there, of course, is, well, if you are taking a ship, if you're, let's say, a voyage charter on a vessel to take it from Europe to the US Gulf Coast, where's that vessel been? And what you don't want to happen, of course, is for your transaction, which has nothing to do with any of these places, you suddenly find that you've chartered a vessel which has 3 or 4 months earlier been doing something perhaps it shouldn't have been, and is then sanctioned with your oil on it. And then you will have a real problem, because you won't be able, of course, to offload potentially, or you'll have to go and get OFAC licenses and all of that sort of thing. So for that reason, the screening on every kind of voyage that you do is quite particularly important.
Yeah. No, I think we talked about, and Lina and I have talked about this as well, but that kind of deep dive process that you engage at the front end, it's pre-engagement, seems to be the important thing. There's a limited amount you can do once you're engaged. but looking at the history, the in-depth processes that I know that all of you employ in terms of vessel screening seems to be absolutely the right way, pre-engagement rather than during it. And there's plenty of examples of people falling foul of that, probably through no fault of their own in many of those cases. Another question I've got for both of you, I think, is another EU change we saw last week, I think, 19th, it came into force, was the change in the oil cap attestation regulations in terms of rather than annual, it's per voyage. But now we're looking also at a new voyage being cargoes that are transferred. So an STS transfer constitutes a reattestation, if that's even a word. I'm not sure that's a word, but reattestation is, anyway, let's call it a word. But again, dealing with situations like that in both of your business lines, Lina, maybe I can ask you first. These are things where I guess you have to be very agile with your teams because this stuff comes at you. It's very quick. It changes very quickly. So you have to be agile in your approach to all of these things. But is there any guidance that, knowing that obviously that was an EU regulation and it creates a lot of complexity? How does a big institution like Glencore deal with that?
To be honest, we do not enter. I mean, I think I briefly mentioned it, but it also applies to oil. We don't enter into new trade contracts with Russian origin material. So that includes oil. But I think I have to come back to a little bit what I said before. So if you do, you have to make sure that you have someone within the company that is an expert on sanctions. So it can be within your company, or you seek help externally so that you are really sure that you understand what are the requirements, what do you need to do. Because if you have risk appetite to deal with Russian oil, then you have to make sure that you follow the rules, right? So I think it's important that to not only have the know-how in-house or get it out or from a law firm, but I think it's also important that you are sufficiently organized so that you have all the requirements under control internally. So that can include a system where all the trades and executions are covered, and an active involvement of compliance, obviously. But it can also it is also key to train the front employees that actually do the deals of their duties and when they have to escalate to compliance. And so, for example, I mentioned we have a Russian legacy business. So what we have done here at Glencore, we have implemented a Russian transaction due diligence process, which means that all Russian Nexus transactions requires a pre-approval by compliance, so per payment. Yep. And we have also implemented the system controls to ensure that everything is covered and that you don't fail the requirements due to a human error because someone forgot or did not know. So it's covering both controls on a contract level, but also on a payment level. So that also obviously requires that you have a good IT department that can help you with that. And I think that is key.
Anything you want to add to that, Richard?
No, I agree, and it's it's not a business that currently we're engaged in. We're not lifting cargo from Russia and haven't for some time. And I actually think the EU's moves in terms of those attestations were arguably a good one, just on a personal point of view. I think when the price cap first came in, some of the attestations that we saw flying around raised some eyebrows. That people were giving to tier 1s and 2s, and you're thinking, really, can you do that? And I think that's good to tighten down on that. I agree with Lina that it's about having all your stakeholders involved, having your IT department there. When you're front and center, I think if you're controlling a transaction, if you're the one actually performing the end-to-end voyage, that's one thing. I think when you're either a tier 2 or tier 3 player, or you're further down a transaction chain that you are buying from somebody else, and you don't have that relationship with the producer, then I think you're a little bit more beholden to to third parties, and you're relying on those third parties being honest. So I think therefore your sort of long-term relationships with those people, and secondly, your KYC should be informing your choices about how and who you might want to deal with in that type of business.
I mean, coming back to again for Lina and Richard primarily, but Eva's points about deceptive practices, illicit activity. I guess actors and players in markets don't get worse at this; they get better at it generally. And we've seen that over years. And a lot of the regulations we're seeing now are focused on, as we said, not just list-based screening, but deceptive, illicit activity, location tampering, and it's spoofing, GNSS manipulation. All of these things are forming part of regulations and guidance that we're seeing. We've seen a sharp increase in this at Windward, where I think actors and players understand that people are looking for AIS gaps. So all of a sudden laying false trails through GNSS and location tampering becomes a very viable option because they know what people are looking for. So maybe, Lina, share us your thoughts on that kind of rising level of deceptive practice we see, and your thoughts around, again, I guess this is that pre-engagement process, deep dive, making sure you're in bed with the right people, but how that plays a part in the whole KYC and program of work at Glencore.
Of course. So what I think is crucial is, first of all, that anyone who uses vessels for any type of shipment, that they're using one of the leading vessel screening tools for not only vessels that they charter themselves, but also for vessels that are nominated to them. So that's the ground pillar here at Glencore. All vessels that we are using, either by booking the vessels ourselves or having vessels nominated to us, we are screening them. And obviously in the vessel screening tools, you can find out information, is the vessel or any of the vessels associates sanctioned? But not only that, as you mentioned, there are more to it to look into than just are the parties sanctioned. We are speaking about dark activity, STS transfers, previous port calls. You can measure, okay, during the dark activity, when the vessel switched on the transponder again, how far has it reached? Is that a normal speed for the vessel, and so on? And I think we are dependent on the vessel screening tools. This is nothing that individual companies should do by themselves, in my view. And I think that I believe that, for example, Windward is using AI to determine certain risks. And I think that is probably the future. I think we're going to see more and more of that. Obviously, needless to say, if you use big shipping lines where you for your transportation, I think that the risk in general is lower than if you don't. But yeah, I think it's key to be on top of also what recommendations with regards to due diligence and checks do the sanctioning authorities recommend. So I can give you one example of a meeting that I had. It was some years ago. I cannot remember exactly which year, maybe 2020 or 2021, something like that. I was in London meeting with the US authorities. They were speaking to traders, commodity traders, in insurance companies, and so on, about vessel risks. And they later on issued then a recommendation, a guidance document based on the input that we had received. So I think that to have an open dialogue with authorities too, to not be afraid of asking questions with authorities is also important. Obviously, you should not ring them every week or so, but I think it is important because they are not expert of how the business is working on a day-to-day basis. So to give you one example, what they had prepared as a suggestion was that every time you're going to use a vessel, they suggested that you're going to be there in the port in person and ask the crew to line up, so that the IMO number is visible, and then you would take a picture of the crew so that you could say, we know that it is you who has been
holding
working
their
on this
passports
vessel.
out as well.
Yeah, in case you would go into a, for example, a sanctioned port. And when I heard that, I was quite shocked, because it just showed maybe how far away the authorities are from the day-to-day business. And I told them that that can under no circumstance be put out as a recommendation. I don't think any crew would feel comfortable to line up there. And also the companies do not necessarily have presence in each port. So yeah, I think but
they've come a long way, I think, Lina. I think, you know, from we can go back quite a while in terms of.
I think so too. Again, it was some years ago, but I think the guidance that we see from the authorities now is not something unreasonable. But I also do think that they are continuing to get feedback from big players of ideas that they want to put out as a guideline.
Yeah, no, I think it's important, and they have been listening. I think prior to that, you went back to the mid-teens. You know, some of those concepts and ideas I heard from state, and I was thinking, my God, you know, never in a million years. This is you know, you'd never implement this or monitor it. They've got better. But Richard, I mean, you know, similar question to you, I guess. You know, I mean, in terms of all of the illicit activity and deceptive practice with these actors and players not getting worse at it. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think a lot of us in the doing compliance now for this shipping have a sort of AML and KYC background, and I think you can transfer a lot of concepts from that. You know, when you come to do your know your customer, it's something you should do holistically. So yes, there is the physical vessel. There's also the company behind it. As Lina says, you know, I think your chances of a big name, you know, Greek shipping tanker company engaging in these practices is significantly lower than, you know, some of the people at the sort of dodgier end of the market, shall we say. And I think therefore it's important to do your KYC to do that, you know, not just using one tool as great as, you know, Windward is. It's one part of your armory. You need to be, you know, have a look at the Q88. You need to be looking at the other screening systems and really sort of getting an understanding, particularly if it's a vessel that you haven't used before. Not only where has this thing been, but also, you know, who owns it, what are its links, what are the sort of, you know, what's the feeling about this thing. And I think that can actually help screen out quite a lot of stuff even before you get to the sort of Windward AI, you know, overlay, which can tell you a little bit more specifically about the vessel itself. I think you're on mute still, Simon.
Oh, Eva, wanted to come back to you. Obviously, when we're talking about all these things, geopolitics, disruptions, we talked about Russia, Ukraine, Red Sea, Venezuela, and you could probably add a whole host of other things to that. But all of these things have an impact. I mean, Lina mentioned about crew and safety, you know, in terms of Red Sea. Is there any kind of guidance that you can give the audience in terms of where these geopolitics fit? I mean, obviously, these are very geared towards what governments, regulators determine as their policies, their foreign policy programs, as they go out there, right? I mean, what do you think happens for the rest of 2024? I know you don't have a crystal ball, but you know, in essence, there's no end to the Red Sea crisis that you can see. There's no timeline with that. So that creates, you know, a compliance, logistics, and operations teams in places like Glencore and Socar with these huge dilemmas as to what to do. But in terms of those geopolitics, can you give a bit of insight as to what you think the best way is for companies to move forward in those areas? I mean, is that?
Yeah, thanks, Simon. Well, indeed, I unfortunately do not have a crystal ball, and it's. Well, there definitely, I mean, as you point out, it doesn't seem like this is something that is going to disappear from one day to another. This is an issue that is even becoming more problematic as we speak, and might become more problematic even more in the future. There are already some reactions. I think the EU here, given the many sensitivities, the issues, the fact that also when it comes to, for instance, defense issues and like defensive vessels, etc., military there, when it comes to the EU, there is still a real issue also in terms of their competence to deal with some of these issues. And one of the, I think, priorities of now the Belgian presidency is to focus more on a bit of a common defense issue also when it comes to the European Union. I think the next presidency of the Commission, that also there, this is going to be looked at. And I think that all of these developments will be fueling geopolitical issues, and specifically for the EU, not only so much in the area of sanctions and compliance there, but when it comes to, it will also drive further change in the EU. For instance, more cooperation in some areas, which I think personally, I think would be helpful to have a more coordinated response of the EU to safeguards, I mean, to safety issues, etc. And that I mean, personally, I think that would be a welcome development. And I think that these developments are fueling the focus thereon, which has been there already for a number of years, but it's still a bit of a sensitive topic. So I do think that we might see more EU level cooperation there. And that's a general trend that we see also, I mean, with sanctions. There's a push towards more EU level involvement rather than just the individual member states. And over the next couple of years, we'll see it more generally, I think.
Yeah. We're heading into the last sort of few minutes of the webinar, but I wanted to come back to Lina and Richard. I mean, if, again, no crystal balls involved, but, you know, if you were giving anybody guidance as to what they should be looking out for, what you're doing, what people can do in terms of industry best practice going forward in these areas, what would you, Richard, what would you, you've got wealth of experience. What's front of your mind right now?
Well, I think, I mean, you know, the Red Sea crisis has showed us one thing. You know, it's a totally different level of question to anything else. You know, whether or not, you know, with AML sanction situations, you know, the worst case scenario is involved fines and, you know, a lot of bad things from a corporate level. But the Red Sea, you know, decisions were being made. Am I going to sail this thing through Suez or around the Cape? If I sail it around the Cape, it's going to cost me £4 or £5 million in extra freight. If I set it through the Red Sea, someone might get killed. And I think that is, you know, something that compliance risk people have, you know, very, very not something that we've really not been involved in before. And that was at a time, you know, when the insurers were willing to let you do it, when, you know, the master of the vessel was willing to let you do it. So you have a lot of sort of things going on in your mind there. You've got to tell the business, you know, I'm going to spend £4 or £5 million of your money because I don't want to risk somebody getting killed, and actually transpire to be the right thing to do, because, you know, I suspect that, you know, those rebel groups are not up to date on the Windward subscription, and you don't want to be relying on their due diligence as to who they're going to shoot at and who they're not, right? So I think for us, we just got away from the combat situation. And I think you have to be mindful of those reputational questions. You have to be mindful of your ongoing business. And I think, you know, it's not a time for sort of trying to make heroic calls that you might get away with and save a few quid. I think it really is, you know, a situation where you have to, first of all, really understand what's going on, do as much due diligence as you can, but ultimately, I think it's something you have to play fairly safely, and that is going to cost time and money, I think, frankly.
And Lina, I mean, over to you in kind of conclusion. I mean, Richard's obviously talked about that kind of moral and dilemma of crew and welfare and everything else, and that safety and security thing that comes into play with yourselves and, I guess, operations in the teams. But, you know, for you looking out forward in your global position, I mean, what is it that's front of your mind? What is it that you're really focused on, would you say, in terms of guidance and processes for the group going forward?
Thanks. I agree with what Richard said, and maybe on top of that, I think it's important, especially if you're a big player, that you have a global approach. You have to sit down with the relevant stakeholders, identify what is your risk appetite, what's our compliance risks that we have, what's our reputational risk, are there other risks like war risk involved, and so on, so that you have a unified approach that's easier than to be consistent and follow and avoid tricky situations. We have spoken about it before, but just worth saying again, vessel screening, very important. Due diligence on your counterparties and other parties involved. Internal compliance, employee expertise, and also to be well protected with contractual clauses. So your vessel nomination clause, sanctions clause, that you have a good contractual protection there as well, in case something would go wrong.
Indeed. We've got a couple of questions actually in the last few minutes from the audience. I think probably I could ask Richard or Lina this one, I guess, but what practices can be implemented to ensure compliance amidst the evolving sanctions landscape, especially where containers and dry bulk are targeted for the first time? I don't know which of you could answer that better, but Lina? Richard, you've taken the mute off.
Yeah, I did. I have no experience of containers, so I have to defer on that one. But in terms of dry bulk, I think you have a very similar set of compliance risks in dry bulk as you do in wet freight, to the extent that you're transporting bulk commodities rather than dual use goods and other things. But and therefore the point is the same, to do that due diligence, to make sure you have somebody or at least some way of keeping up to date with these evolving sanctions, because you've got, it's not particularly coordinated. You've got the US doing one thing, you've got people on the UK list who are not on the EU list, and people on the EU list not on the UK list. So you have to have people tracking, you have to be re-screening. I mean, what you don't want to do is sort of approve a vessel and leave it in your database forever, because without rechecking it, because you checked it once doesn't mean it's going to be okay in the future.
The next time,
they get sold, the ownership change. You've got to be on top of that, I think, and be on top of both the letter of the sanctions changing, and I think the spirit of the sanctions, right? I mean, when the price cap came out, it was very much a case of, either you use Western insurers and you stick with the price cap, or you don't, and that's up to you. Whereas now it's, we've got the shadow fleet, and there's impliedly something bad about it. That's a change in narrative rather than a change of law. So I think you've got to be attuned to that as well.
And Lina, with the big team that you work with, obviously technology, and as you've talked about, experts in field working together becomes, in this climate, it's kind of absolutely mission critical. Is there any way that you've managed to do that you could share with the audience, maybe?
Sorry, managed to do what? Sorry, I couldn't hear.
In terms of technology and your compliance team. So you need, I'm a big believer that human beings and technology work together to make this right.
So when we select tools that we are using to help us being compliant, I think it is important to turn to one of the market leaders. It's important to understand how much does, for example, the vessel screening company invest in the tool, because there could be a vessel screening tool that is good today, but if they are not investing in the tool, they may not be good tomorrow. So I think that is crucial. And to answer to your previous question too, what you should look out for, I think it is important to have a global minimum standard in your company. So we spoke about it a little bit before. So we cannot say, I don't follow UK sanctions because, or you can, but maybe not so wise. I don't follow UK sanctions because I am not in the UK. But if you would have an approach to only follow applicable sanctions, it is almost, deemed to fail sooner or later, rather sooner, because in one way or the other, there could be a UK element involved that would trigger the applicability of the UK sanctions.
Yeah.
So I think that your company needs to define what's the global minimum standard, which sanctions from which sanctioning authorities do we want to follow globally, irrespective of whether they apply or not. And then you have to implement that in your contractual clauses too, and not just say we are going to comply with the sanctions, right? And with regards to the screening, so I have understood that there is now a possibility to screen the bill of lading, so that you can follow the containers, not only on the first vessel, but actually on the subsequent vessels.
The transshipments.
Which will also protect you more than when you just screen the first vessel.
100%.
That's some additions to what you have already said before.
We're right on the hour, and I just wanted to close by saying to Lina, Eva, Richard, thank you so much. I'm confident that people have a lot of takeaways from your guidance and advice today. It was a pleasure to speak with you all, and thank you so much for finding the time to spending the hour today. I hope everyone enjoyed today. Again, if there's any of our insights that anyone needs or would like to see, please reach out to us. And thank you all again, and have a great day. Thanks, everybody. Thank you very much.
Simon.
Thanks,
everyone.
Simon.
Very much.
Pleasure. Bye.